There is a quiet assumption people make when someone doesn't react. They assume something is missing, that the person didn't feel enough, didn't understand enough, or didn't care enough. Because in a world where emotions are constantly expressed, displayed, and broadcasted, reaction has slowly become proof of feeling. We've been conditioned to believe that visible emotion equals depth, that the louder the response, the stronger the experience must be. So when someone remains calm, still, composed, it doesn't just go unnoticed, it feels unnatural. It disrupts expectations. People start searching for explanations. They question the person's awareness, their empathy, even their humanity. Because silence in an emotionally reactive culture is often misread as absence. But what's rarely considered is this: not all emotions demand expression. Not all understanding needs to be proven. And not all depth is visible on the surface. Sometimes what looks like stillness is actually restraint. What looks like distance is actually processing. And what looks like nothing is often something far more controlled, far more deliberate, because there is a difference between not feeling and choosing not to react. One comes from disconnection. The other comes from awareness. So maybe the absence of reaction is not emptiness. Maybe it is not confusion. Maybe it is not indifference. Maybe it's control. And in a world that constantly rewards emotional display, control can feel almost invisible, but that doesn't make it weak. If anything, it makes it rare. Why people expect reactions. Most people are conditioned to expect emotional feedback. You say something, you expect a response. You trigger something, you expect a reaction. It's almost automatic, not because people consciously demand it, but because they've been trained to rely on it. From early conversations to adult relationships, we learn to read emotions through visible signals. A smile means approval. A frown means disapproval. A quick reply means interest. Silence means something is wrong. Because reactions create reassurance. They stabilize the interaction. They confirm that the connection is active, that the exchange is mutual, that what you said landed somewhere. They tell you, I have impact. I am being heard. I matter in this moment. And for many people, that reassurance is not just comforting, it's necessary. Because without it, uncertainty begins to grow. And uncertainty is something most people struggle to tolerate. So when a reaction doesn't come, when the expected emotional feedback is missing, something starts to feel off. The mind begins to search for meaning. Did I say something wrong? Did they not understand me? Are they ignoring me? Do they not care? And in that absence of response, people often project their own fears into the silence. Because silence leaves space, and most people are not comfortable with empty space. They rush to fill it with assumptions, interpretations, conclusions, not because something is actually wrong, but because something is unfamiliar. You see, familiarity creates comfort, and most social interactions follow predictable emotional patterns. Someone speaks, the other reacts, someone expresses, the other responds. It's a rhythm people rely on without even realizing it. So when that rhythm is broken, when one person does not immediately react, the entire interaction feels unbalanced, almost like a conversation missing a beat. But that discomfort doesn't come from actual harm. It comes from disruption, from stepping outside what people are used to. Because when reactions disappear, people are left alone with their own interpretation. And that can feel far more intense than any visible response. So the issue is not always the silence itself. It's what the silence forces people to confront. The absence of reassurance, the absence of control, the absence of predictable feedback. And for many, yet that absence is deeply unsettling. Empaths don't lack emotion. In fact, they often feel more than most people in the room, not just their own emotions. but the subtle emotional atmosphere around them, the tension no one names, the discomfort someone is hiding, the shift in tone that others overlook. They pick up on all of it. But here's the difference. They don't always express what they feel instantly. They don't rush to translate emotion into reaction. They pause because for them, feeling is not something shallow or surface level. It's layered, complex, sometimes even overwhelming. So instead of reacting outwardly, they turn inward first. They process it deeply, silently, internally. And that internal processing is not passive. It's active awareness. While others are reacting in real time, trying to keep up with the moment, empaths are slowing the moment down. They are observing it from multiple angles at once, not just what is happening, but why it is happening. Not just the words being spoken, but the intention behind them. Not just the emotion being shown, but the emotion being suppressed. While others react outwardly, empaths are already analyzing what is being said, what is being implied, what is being hidden beneath the words. They notice inconsistencies. They feel emotional undertones. They sense when something doesn't align. And because of this, they rarely take things at face value, which is why their silence is often misunderstood, because from the outside, it looks like they are doing nothing, but internally, they are doing everything. They are filtering, interpreting, understanding, connecting patterns, reading between lines that most people don't even realize exist. And this takes time. It requires space. It cannot be rushed. So while others move quickly from trigger to reaction, empaths move from perception to understanding. And that path is slower, but far more precise, because by the time others are reacting, the empath is already understanding. They've already processed the emotional weight of the moment. They've already identified what feels genuine and what feels performative. They've already decided what deserves a response and what doesn't. So their lack of immediate reaction is not delay. It's discernment. It's the result of a mind that refuses to respond without clarity, a mind that values accuracy over speed. Because for an empath, reacting too quickly often means reacting incorrectly. And they've learned through experience that not every feeling needs to become a visible reaction. Some feelings are meant to be understood first. And that understanding is where their real response begins. For most people, emotion moves outward. It rises and is almost immediately expressed through words, through tone, through facial expressions, through reaction. Because expression has become the default response to feeling. But for empaths, it works differently. For empaths, emotion moves inward first. It doesn't rush outward. It pauses, it settles, it gets examined before it gets expressed. They don't rush to respond because they don't trust first impressions. They've learned, often through difficult experiences, that the first emotional reaction is not always the most accurate one. Sometimes it's incomplete. Sometimes it's influenced by past experiences. Sometimes it's triggered by something deeper than the current moment. So instead of reacting immediately, they hold it. They sit with it. They let it unfold internally before deciding what it actually means, because they've learned something through experience. Not every emotion deserves expression. Just because you feel something, that doesn't mean it needs to be shown. Not every situation deserves energy. Just because something happens doesn't mean it deserves your attention. Not every trigger deserves reaction. Just because something provokes you doesn't mean it controls you. And this awareness changes everything, because once you realize that reaction is a choice, not an obligation, you stop giving it away so freely. So instead of reacting, they observe, they step back internally. They watch the interaction as it unfolds. They notice patterns. They notice tone shifts. They notice emotional inconsistencies. They become aware not just of what is happening, but of how it is happening. And this observation creates space, space between feeling and response, space between trigger and action, space that allows clarity to form. But from the outside, that space is often misunderstood because people are used to immediate feedback, immediate emotion, immediate validation of what just happened. So when that reaction doesn't come, when the empath remains still, quiet, composed, it gets misinterpreted. Observation is often mistaken for indifference. Silence is mistaken for lack of care. Stillness is mistaken for emotional absence. But the reality is the opposite. The empath is not disconnected. They are deeply connected, just not outwardly expressive in the same way. They are choosing depth over display, understanding over impulsive reaction, clarity over emotional noise, and that choice makes them appear different. Because in a world where most people show what they feel immediately, the person who chooses to process first will always stand out, not because they feel less, but because they feel with more awareness. Silence removes feedback. It takes away the immediate signals people rely on to understand what's happening in an interaction. No expression, no reaction, no clear emotional response. And when that feedback disappears, people lose control of the interaction because most social dynamics are built on reading and responding to emotional cues. A reaction tells you where you stand. It tells you if you're being accepted, rejected, understood, or challenged. But silence removes that clarity. They can't read you. There's no visible emotion to interpret, no tone to analyze, no reaction to decode. They can't predict you because prediction depends on patterns, and silence breaks those patterns. Without a reaction, there is no immediate direction, no way to anticipate what comes next. They can't influence you easily because influence often depends on triggering emotion. If someone can provoke a reaction, they can guide the interaction. They can escalate it, de-escalate it, or redirect it. But when there is no reaction, that leverage disappears, and that creates discomfort, not because something is necessarily wrong, but because something familiar is missing. Because most interactions are built on emotional exchange. You say something, the other person reacts. You push, they respond. You express, they mirror. It's a constant loop of action and reaction, and people unconsciously rely on that loop to feel oriented, to feel in control, to feel like they understand what's happening. But when one person refuses to participate in that exchange impulsively, the dynamic shifts, the rhythm breaks, the expected pattern dissolves, and suddenly the interaction feels uneven, uncertain, unstable, because now the usual rules don't apply. Suddenly, the loudest person doesn't feel powerful anymore because volume without reaction loses its impact. Intensity without feedback loses its direction. The person trying to dominate the interaction no longer knows if it's working, and that uncertainty can be deeply unsettling. Because power in many social situations comes from the ability to affect others emotionally, to get a response, to create movement. But silence interrupts that completely. It creates a kind of psychological stillness that cannot be easily influenced or controlled. And for someone who relies on reaction to feel effective, that stillness feels like resistance, even when it isn't. So the discomfort isn't just about silence itself. It's about what silence represents: a lack of access, a lack of control, a lack of predictable influence. And for many people, that absence is far more unsettling than any reaction could ever be. There is a level of emotional discipline most people never reach, not because it's impossible, but because it requires something most people avoid: awareness, patience, and the willingness to sit with emotion without immediately acting on it, the ability to feel something without immediately expressing it, to experience anger without releasing it instantly, to feel hurt without displaying it right away, to notice discomfort without reacting impulsively. That kind of control is rare because most people are taught that emotions should be expressed as they arise, that holding back is unhealthy, that reacting quickly is honest, that immediate expression equals authenticity. But emotional discipline challenges that idea. It introduces a different possibility, that not every feeling needs to become action, the ability to be triggered without reacting to the trigger, to notice when something provokes you, but not let it dictate your behavior, to recognize the emotional surge without surrendering control to it. Because a trigger is not just about the present moment. It often carries fragments of the past, old experiences, unresolved emotions, patterns that repeat themselves, and reacting instantly means responding not just to what is happening now, but to everything it reminds you of. Emotional self-control interrupts that cycle. It creates a pause, a space where you can separate what is real from what is remembered, the ability to understand without needing to prove that understanding, to see clearly what is happening or without explaining it to everyone involved, to recognize behavior without confronting it unnecessarily, to know something without needing validation for knowing it, because not all understanding needs to be announced. Some clarity is internal, some awareness is quiet, and some truths lose their power the moment they are forced into expression. Empaths, especially mature ones, develop this naturally over time, not overnight, not without struggle, but gradually through experience, through moments where reacting too quickly created consequences, through situations where emotional expression was used against them, through interactions where giving immediate reactions gave others control. And over time, they begin to see a pattern. Uncontrolled emotion has a cost. It can escalate conflict. It can expose vulnerability to the wrong people. It can lead to misunderstandings that could have been avoided, so they adapt, not because they are detached, but because they have learned. They have seen what uncontrolled emotion can cost. They have felt the aftermath of reacting too soon, too intensely, too openly, and instead of shutting down, they refine. They become more precise with their responses, more intentional with their energy, more selective with their expression, because emotional self-control is not suppression. It is direction. It is the ability to feel deeply without being ruled by what you feel. And that is a form of strength most people don't recognize until they encounter it. At some point, many empaths go through a shift. They stop over-explaining. They stop defending themselves unnecessarily. They stop trying to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding them. And from the outside, this looks like withdrawal. But internally, it is alignment. They are no longer reacting to every perception. They are choosing where their energy goes. There is a difference between reacting and responding. Reaction is immediate. Response is intentional. Reaction is emotional. Response is controlled. Reaction is unconscious. Response is aware. Empaths who don't react are not passive. They are selective. They choose when something deserves their voice and when it doesn't. And maybe this is what unsettles people the most. Not the silence itself, but what the silence represents, because silence is often misread as emptiness, disinterest, or emotional distance. But in many cases, it carries something far more powerful underneath it. It represents a level of internal control that most people are not used to encountering in everyday interactions. A person who cannot be easily triggered cannot be easily controlled, because control in many social dynamics doesn't come from authority or strength alone. It often comes from emotional access. If someone can provoke a reaction in you, they can influence your direction. They can shape the conversation. They can pull you into their emotional rhythm. But when that access disappears, when triggers no longer produce automatic responses, the usual mechanisms stop working. A person who does not react impulsively cannot be easily manipulated, because impulsive reaction is what keeps many interactions predictable. It creates openings. It creates emotional exposure. It creates moments where judgment is suspended and feeling takes over. But when someone pauses instead, when they observe instead of react, when they choose response instead of impulse, then those openings close. And what remains is unpredictability. A person who feels deeply but chooses carefully becomes unpredictable, not chaotic, but unreadable in the sense that others can no longer assume automatic emotional outcomes. They can no longer rely on familiar patterns of reaction. They cannot easily predict how the person will respond, or even if they will respond at all. And in a world built on emotional reactions, that kind of control feels almost unnatural, because most systems of communication, validation, and interaction are designed around emotional feedback loops. People are expected to respond, to react, to mirror energy back in real time. It creates a sense of flow, connection, and mutual influence. So when someone breaks that pattern, when they remain steady where others expect reaction, it disrupts something deeper than conversation. It disrupts expectation itself, but it isn't unnatural. It is simply rare. Rare because it requires awareness. Rare because it requires restraint. Rare because it requires understanding the space between feeling and expression, because the strongest form of emotion is not expression. It is mastery, the ability to feel fully without being controlled by what is felt, the ability to remain present without being pulled into reaction. And that kind of emotional mastery is what truly unsettles people the most. At some point, many empaths go through a shift. It doesn't happen all at once. It builds slowly through experience, through repeated moments of being misunderstood, through conversations where their intentions were questioned, through situations where no amount of explaining seemed to change the outcome, and eventually something changes. They stop over-explaining. They no longer feel the need to clarify every detail, to justify every action, to make sure everyone sees them correctly, because they begin to realize something important. Not all misunderstandings are accidents. Some are chosen. They stop defending themselves unnecessarily. They no longer rush to correct every assumption. They no longer feel obligated to respond to every misinterpretation because they start to see the pattern. That constant defense does not always create clarity. Sometimes it creates exhaustion. Sometimes it gives more energy to situations that were never meant to be resolved in the first place. They stop trying to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding them. And this is one of the hardest lessons to learn, because empaths naturally want clarity. They want mutual understanding. They want things to make sense, to feel resolved, to feel complete. But over time, they begin to recognize when understanding is not the goal, when the other person is not listening to understand, but listening to respond, not seeking truth, but reinforcing their own perspective. And in those moments, the empath changes approach. They step back, not out of defeat, but out of awareness. And from the outside, this looks like withdrawal. It can look like distance, like silence, like disengagement. People may assume they've become cold or uninterested or emotionally unavailable, but internally, it is something very different. It is alignment. It is the decision to stop investing energy where it is consistently misused. They are no longer reacting to every perception. They are no longer trying to control how they are seen by everyone. They are no longer adjusting themselves to fit every external expectation. Instead, they become selective with their words, selective with their explanations, selective with where they place their attention. They are choosing where their energy goes, and that choice changes everything. Because once you stop explaining yourself to everyone, you begin to conserve something valuable, your clarity, your peace, your emotional stability. You stop scattering your energy across every misunderstanding and start directing it toward what actually matters. And while others may see less effort, less explanation, less engagement, what they are actually witnessing is a higher level of awareness, a shift from proving to simply being. And that shift is where real emotional strength begins. Here's something interesting. When you stop reacting, people often try harder to get a reaction out of you. At first, it's subtle, a slightly sharper tone, a more pointed comment, a small push to see if something changes. But when nothing happens, when you remain steady, calm, unaffected, the effort increases. They push more. They test more. They provoke more. They repeat themselves. They exaggerate. They escalate their behavior. And from the outside, it can seem confusing. Why would someone intensify their behavior just because they're not getting a reaction? But psychologically, it makes sense because your non-reaction disrupts their expectations. Most people are used to a certain pattern. Action leads to reaction. Stimulus leads to response. Cause leads to visible effect. It's predictable. It's familiar. And more importantly, it's controllable, because when someone can trigger a reaction in you, they gain influence over the interaction. They can steer it, shape it, escalate it, or calm it down. But when that reaction doesn't happen, the pattern breaks. And when the pattern breaks, control disappears. Suddenly, they don't know where they stand. They don't know if what they're doing is working. They don't know how to adjust because there is no feedback to guide them. And people are uncomfortable when they can't control the emotional direction of a situation. Uncertainty creates tension, and tension pushes people to act. So they escalate, not always consciously, not always intentionally, but instinctively. They increase intensity in an attempt to restore the familiar dynamic, to get something, anything that confirms their impact, a reaction, a response, a visible shift. Because even a negative reaction feels better than no reaction at all. At least it provides clarity. At least it restores the sense of influence. But here's what they don't realize. You've already stepped out of the game. You're no longer participating in the cycle of action and reaction. You're no longer responding automatically to external triggers. You're observing instead of engaging. And from that position, their attempts lose power, because provocation only works when there is something to provoke. And control only exists when someone is reacting to be controlled. So while they are trying harder, pushing further, testing limits, you've already changed the rules entirely. And in many cases, you're no longer even playing.